Okay, I think we're all set up. I think we're good to go. This is the second Google Hangout for HST 102 in Global Freshman Academy. I'm Ian Moulton, and I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the questions that you have about the course. And we've got a lot of good ones this week, so I'm just going to take them in the order that they were given, and we can sort of work our way through them. First one. Greek civilization and the things we didn't talk about with the Greeks, which is a lot. Several people pointed out that we didn't talk about we focused, as very often people do when they're studying ancient Greece, on the 5th century in Athens. This is the time when a lot of the greatest writing is going on, some of the greatest political developments. It's sort of the period in which the Athenians defeat the Persians, the Greeks, led by the Athenians and the Spartans, defeat the Persians. It also is not once, of course, but twice. And also the beginnings of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. This is often seen as the kind of crux period of Greek history, and we spent a lot of time on that. Similarly with Rome, one tends to spend time on the fall of the Republic, the rise of the empire. There are various reasons for this, and it's worth thinking about. One is that we work mostly with texts. Still, we work with archaeology and various other things, and the way we get our information about the classical period is multifaceted. But if we're talking about texts, we tend to stress the periods the texts come from, and so they come from 5th century Athens. This is obviously a high point. The Greeks saw it as a high point of their culture and civilization, both in terms of their artistic output and in terms of their political achievements. So yes, we focus on that. That led us to not focus as much on the earlier forms of Greek civilization, which are very interesting. There are early civilizations on the Greek islands. There's very interesting civilization on the island of Crete, which is not exactly Greek, that develops in all sorts of interesting ways and then very quickly vanishes. Some of this has been linked to an explosion on one of the Greek islands. There was a volcano, basically, that one of the smaller Greek islands that exploded. The volcano just had a massive eruption, which not only destroyed the island itself, but also may have damaged seriously civilizations on other islands, including the island of Crete. Some people think this is where the myth of Atlantis comes from, the idea that there once was a city and now it has been, sort of sunk under the waves. Obviously, their term Atlantis links us to the Atlantic Ocean, but if they were thinking in a smaller framework, then this cataclysmic volcanic eruption would be something that was interesting. But in any case, there were all sorts of early civilizations on the Greek islands, in Crete, in the Aegean Sea generally. There were early civilizations on the Greek mainland around Mycenae. Some of this is the material that later Homer sort of idealizes and mythologizes in his poems on the Trojan War, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The history of these places is unclear. The written record is very scattered, and what we do know is that there seems to be a period that historians have called the Dark Ages of Greece, from about 1000 BC to about 600 BC. And this is a period between the collapse of the civilization of Mycenae and the rise of sort of classical Athens and so on. So one of the things when we're trying to get about 5,000 years of history into a 7-week course, there are important things that we don't talk about. And early Greek civilization, early Aegean civilization is one of them. Fascinating topic. Another area where the next time I redesign the course, I think we may change this, but it's the way the course developed. We don't really spend a whole lot of time on Alexander the Great and the Greek and Macedonian conquest of the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE under Alexander. There are several reasons why we didn't stress this more. We tended to focus, we had a week on Greece, so we focused on classical Athens. We had a week on Rome, so we focused on the sort of high period of the Republic into the Empire and the early years of the Empire, the expansion of Rome. What we didn't do was focus on the link between these two things, which in some ways is the Hellenistic civilizations that develop following Alexander. Just very briefly, classical Greece, as we saw, was a series of city-states that were often in conflict. in around 300 BC, the 350 BC, that period, you start to see the rise of a northern power in what is called Macedonia. And this is an area to the north of Greece where people speak Greek and are sort of on the fringes of Greek civilization. A lot of Greeks from places like Athens and Sparta and Thebes don't consider Macedonians to properly be, you know, as Greek as they are, but that's kind of a moot point in some ways. In any case, the Macedonians are a very powerful warrior people. They have strong centralized leadership under their king Philip and his son Alexander. And what Philip does is he basically conquers all of Greece and forces them to live under Macedonian rule. He conquers Athens, he conquers Sparta, Thebes, the other Corinth, the major cities of Greece, unifies them under his rule very much against their will. And then his son Alexander, instead of staying in Greece and consolidating that, he attacks Persia, which is kind of a crazy thing for him to do given how big Persia is and how small, relatively speaking, Macedonia and Greece are. But Alexander seems to have been a military genius, and certainly his troops fought very well against the Persians. There's a history of Greek troops fighting very well against Persians, and part of this may be because Greek troops are very often not mercenaries. Question as to why the Greeks were better soldiers than the Persians. The Persians very often had very large, not particularly well-trained armies that were often under multilingual command, and they tried to win battles through sheer numbers, whereas the Greeks tended to be very compact, highly trained fighting forces that were very efficient and in their ways of fighting. So what would happen is a small force of Greeks would be confronted by a large number of Persians. The Greeks would defeat the Persians they were fighting, and all the other Persians on the battlefield would run away. And the Greeks would win. In any case, Alexander, in a remarkably short period of time, conquers the entire Persian Empire, kills the king of Persia, is killed fleeing from Alexander, and Alexander now rules everything from Greece and Macedonia all the way to what is now Afghanistan, to the frontiers of what is now Pakistan. He actually is campaigning on the Indus River in what is modern Pakistan. And then it all falls apart very quickly. Alexander gets all of a sudden at a party at his new imperial palace in Persepolis. He dies, and that's the end of Alexander. But what the cultural significance of this is that his conquests remain in place, and very quickly the empire fractures into 4 or 5 competing zones. A zone in Egypt, a zone in what is now Iran, and so on, a zone in Greece and Macedonia. But all of these areas are ruled by kings who are descended from Alexander's generals, and the most important thing for our purposes, perhaps, is that they all speak Greek and have Greek sort of cultural values that have been imported by Alexander's armies and are adopted very often by the people who are living in these particular places. And this is why this civilization is often called Hellenic, Hellenes being the Greek word for the Greeks. So it's not Greek, it's Greekish, it's like Greece. These empires are eventually conquered either by the Romans if they're in the western portion in Egypt, or in what is now Turkey or what is now Greece. Those areas eventually fall into the Roman Empire, and the eastern portions of the Hellenic lands end up being conquered by the Parthians, who are sort of the successor empire in what is now Iran. And those territories are no longer sort of ruled by the successors of Alexander's generals, but the Greek culture remains. And in fact, Greek is the language spoken primarily for administration, even in the Eastern Roman Empire, all the way through. Latin is never the dominant language in places like Damascus and Byzantium, later Constantinople, Athens, so on. They keep speaking Greek, and the Roman Empire at the official level is a bilingual empire. It's Latin in the West and Greek in the East. And of course, that doesn't even address the many, many languages that people speak in particular cities and towns across the scope of the empire. But in terms of administrative language, the language of the courts, the language of the army, the language of higher education, that tends to be Latin and Greek. And so Alexander is an area where there's obviously this great connection between the Eastern and Western empires too, because Alexander is ruling areas that we consider very Western and European, like Greece, but he's also ruling areas that most people would consider Asian or non-European, like the heartlands of Persia in what is now Iran, and also the area that is in Mesopotamia and what is now Iraq. And it's an interesting moment of cultural blending. It also brings together in interesting ways Greece and India, and this is an interesting subject and on all sorts of levels, and one that I think has not been sufficiently explored. So the short answer to all this is yes, we should have covered all this stuff in more detail, but there's only so much you can do when you're covering from 3000 BC to 1500 AD in 7 weeks, and this is an area that got later coverage perhaps than it merits. Next question is about, excuse me while I have a drink. Water. The word slave, and this is a great, I love the history of language and where words come from. I think you can learn a lot from that. And the word slave, the question brings up that the word slave is a relatively late European term from the word Slav, and this is true. Our current word slave comes from the French esclave, which comes from the words for Slav, meaning Slavic peoples, meaning Eastern European peoples, Russians, Southern Slavs in places like Serbia and so on. Why did Slavs become slaves? This is because in the Middle Ages, very often these people, the Slavs who were sort of came in contact with more Western parts of Europe were enslaved in various ways. But anyway, there's this notion that Slavs are slaves, and that word comes to be the dominant term used in English, in French, in Spanish for the condition of slavery, which is the condition of one person being the property of someone else and being owned by them, having to work for no pay, and having to work in forced conditions, having no legal rights, et cetera, et cetera. That complex of conditions becomes known as slavery, and the people who are subject to it are slaves. And this, of course, begs the question, if this is a 9th century term, it doesn't really come into English until about the 13th century, the word slave. What were these people called in Greece and Rome? And the interesting answer is that in Latin, the most common word for slave was servus, S-E-R-V-U-S, which looks to us like service or servant. Now, we make enormous distinctions in our own culture between servants and slaves. Slaves are people who are held against their will and are forced to work. They are not paid in any way. They have no civil or legal rights, and they are legally classified as property of other people. Servants, on the other hand, are people who work to help other people out. And if you think about how the word servant is related to the word service, one of the largest areas of a modern economy is the service industry. Are all these people slaves? You know, when you go to the hotel, or the people who you know, make your food at restaurants, or people who do landscaping work or whatever, obviously they're not slaves, but they're in some sense in service industries. That means servus. One of the things this points out is that in ancient Rome, there's not much distinction made. We make this distinction between people who are paid to do this work, which is fine. It might not be the most desirable job in the world, but it might also be a good job. And it depends on what you're paid, depends on the conditions of work, depends on who you are and what you want from life. And slaves, nobody wants to be a slave. But in ancient Rome, there's only one word for both, servus. And the person who asked the question on the site was, you didn't call galley slaves servus, did you? And yes, you did. There were specific terms for galley slaves, but yes, galley slaves were servus. The Greek term that is analogous to this is a word that doesn't really have, that I can think of, a modern English cognate, and that's the word doulos. Doulos was the Greek word for slave. They also had other words for slave. They had a word that distinguished between slaves who were born slaves and slaves who were captured in battle. So there will be accounts of, you know, a city is conquered and they're afraid that the population is going to be enslaved by the city that conquered them, which was a fairly common occurrence in ancient Greece. And the words they use in that case is not the word doulos. They have another term for that. But Neither of these terms has come into modern English, partly because modern English doesn't draw as tightly from Greek as it does from Latin for all sorts of historical reasons. The other interesting thing about terminology for slaves is both in Greek and Latin, a very common word for slave is the word for boy. In Latin, the word puer is always used for slaves, or often used for slaves. It's sometimes used also to describe non-slave boys. And in Greece, you get the exact same thing. Pais, which means child, is used for slaves. So again, we would distinguish enormously between children and slaves. Children and slaves are not the same thing. But in Greece and Rome, the same word was used for both. And this is interesting in part because it gets, one of the things it gets me thinking about is questions of ownership of children. What is the legal status of children? Are children property of their parents? That's not exactly true, but children, like slaves, do not have any, very often, especially in ancient societies, do not have any independent legal existence. They are not subjects under the law. They belong to somebody else. And so it's interesting that in a Latin text, if someone says puer, you always have to think, well, is he referring to a slave who's there, or is he talking about a boy, a young male child? And both children and slaves are not allowed to participate in sort of adult politics, et cetera, et cetera. Their conditions under which they're treated are different, though children are sometimes brought up very harshly. And beaten like slaves are beaten, and so on. You can see there's all sorts of interesting sociological things that come up from this linking of the word for boy or child and the word for slave. And this does persist into English and into the modern world, because in the United States, when slavery was an institution, very often African-American slaves would be referred to by their owners as boy. A full-grown man, often even an old man, would, hey boy, come over here. Hey boy, do this. And that's a derogatory term in some sense, because it's refusing to recognize the person's status as an adult, as a grown-up. But it also connects back to this older Greek and Latin usage where slaves were referred to as by the same words used for children. And that still remains to today an insulting term to call someone in the United States to refer to an adult as boy. There's some gender going on in this, in that, because girl is not used quite the same way. It's an interesting question. It goes sort of beyond the bounds of our course, but this is all interesting stuff to think about. And the words that people use, one of the things we have to remember when we're looking at all these ancient texts is that we're looking at them all in translation, and very often the words we use are not directly analogous to the words that the people used at the time. And that creates some interesting historic opportunities for historical knowledge, because if you look at the words they used, you can see the way that they thought. If they're using the same word for boy and for slave, there must be some equivalence in their minds between slaves and children. And that's an interesting insight into what people thought about slaves. Next point. According to Islam, it was not Abraham's second son Isaac that was to be sacrificed, but Ishmael, his second son, and also the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It is beside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and both of these points, yes, they're correct. We need to remove the reference to the Dome of the Rock's a mosque, which was has been in the course. I thought we had removed that, but we need to go back and make sure it's gone everywhere. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine that commemorates a holy site and is not a mosque, which is a place of prayer. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is next to it, and they're part of the same sort of Muslim complex of sacred places on Temple Mount. But yes, that's absolutely correct that the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. Next question is, what about Rome and gender? The founding of the Roman Republic was based on Lucretia being avenged for being raped by the son of the Roman king. And this is a legend that we went over in the class. This would suggest rape was punished. Was this still the case under the Roman Republic and laws of the empire? And this is an interesting question of sort of gender politics. Story of the rape of Lucretia, in case you don't remember it, just very briefly to run through it. Lucretia is the wife of a Roman nobleman, and he's out campaigning with the son of the king, the prince, Tarquin, and they're bragging on their wives and saying what great people, who has the best wife, who has the most chaste wife, et cetera, et cetera. And they decide, let's find out what our wives are doing when we're away. And they go back, and everyone's wife is partying down and flirting with people and drinking too much and so on, except for Lucretia, who is sitting like she's supposed to be, spinning cloth with her maidens and, you know, living a chaste life of a Roman matron. Perversely, this chastity, the fact that Lucretia is such a good wife and such a good woman, is a real attraction to Tarquin, who decides that this is the woman that he has to have sex with, and he goes back later and rapes Lucretia, and then leaves. He goes back in the night when he goes as a guest to her house. He comes in, he rapes her in the night, and then he leaves. She is so devastated by this and feels that she has done something wrong in having let this happen, though she was pretty much powerless to stop it under the circumstances. She kills herself out of sort of shame, and then her male relatives, including the first Brutus, they take revenge on Tarquin and his family and drive the kings out of Rome, which establishes the Republic. And so this is a legend. There's no truth. There's no proof that any of this actually happened, though something certainly might have sparked a similar uprising. But what it establishes is that kings are taking too much advantage in the story of the rights of their nobles, of their leading subjects, and that because of this, the rule has to be by those leading subjects and not by the kings, and therefore Rome gets rid of kings, because the idea is that kings will always abuse their powers. They have too much power, and they will abuse their powers. And the abuse of power is interestingly seen as an abuse of the powers of the richest and most powerful people. This is not some sort of the kings are mean to the common people, that the common people have very little role in this story. The idea is that the king is being unfair to the top nobles. And this, interestingly, comes up again in Magna Carta, as we'll see next week in medieval England, where Magna Carta is often seen as one of the first legal documents that establishes the rights of people against sovereigns. And this is done not as a sort of defense of the common people at all. It's done as a defense of the nobles against the king. So this is very much a fight amongst the elite. But to get back to the gender issues around Lucretia and the way this plays out, yes, rape is punished. A rape is a very serious crime if it's the rape of a citizen woman. The crime, however, is not a crime against the woman. The crime is the crime against whoever the woman belongs to. Her husband if she's married, her father if she's not married, her brothers if the father is no longer living and she's not married. In other words, it's seen as a property crime against the men of the family, not as a personal crime, let alone a sexual crime against the woman involved. And this is also brought out in words. The word rape in the Latin word for rape is raptus in Latin. And raptus in Latin gives us two words in English. One is rape, is rapture. And you can see that rape and rapture in contemporary English are very different words. Rape means that someone has sexually abused you against your will and you've been assaulted, specifically sexually. Raptus means that you've been rapture means that you've been carried up to heaven by God. And or you've been carried away by some sort of pleasurable feeling. And the root meaning of the Latin word raptus is to be carried off. The idea is sort of like with the story of the Trojan War and Paris taking Helen. The woman is actually, sort of slung over the man's back, and he runs away with her. He steals her. He takes her away. He carries her off. It is a raptus. In Roman mythology and Greek mythology, there are endless stories, a lot of them in Ovid's Metamorphosis, great Latin poem, of human beings being carried off by some god or other, usually a male god, usually Jupiter or Zeus, but there are all sorts of variations on the theme. But the idea is that they're being carried up to heaven by the god, but they're also being taken possession of sexually by the god. The god is having sex with them and also taking them away. This is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the story and depending on who you are and depending on what you want. It's always a sort of overpowering thing and a loss of agency on the part of the human being who's subject to it. Sometimes this is celebrated. So-and-so Ganymede was carried up to heaven, and sometimes it is it is seen as something very cruel. But it's an interesting link there. And it's interesting to just think about the difference between Roman society and our own society when we think that rape is not seen as a crime against women. It's seen as a crime against the men of the family. And it once again is an ownership thing, because if a slave boy was raped or something like that, that if it was seen as a crime at all, would be a crime against the owner of the slave whose property had been damaged. It would not be seen as, and the same thing would be the case if an aristocratic boy was sexually abused by someone. That would be seen as a crime primarily against his father and his family. So it all comes down to the notion of people being subordinate in almost a kind of property relations kind of way. Next question is about Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, one of the great works of history, written in the 18th century. It's a magnificent read. 18th century prose can be a little daunting, but it is beautiful, and Gibbon is very smart, and he tells the story very well. And The Decline and Fall is a very long book. I haven't read the whole thing. I've read pieces of it. I would, if I had 3 months, it would be a great thing to just sit and read Decline and Fall from beginning to end. Gibbon, one of the things he does in Decline and Fall is he blames the decline of the Roman Empire on Christianity. His argument is the Romans were, and this is being a bit reductive, but in large part his argument is the Romans were a strong, warlike people who then became soft with Christian values. Christianity did a couple of things. One is it introduced the idea that being passive was good. If you look at the life of Jesus, for example, what does Jesus do? Jesus preaches and speaks out, but then when the Romans come and arrest him, he just puts up with it. He doesn't fight back. Peter tries to fight back and cuts the ear off the man arresting Jesus, and Jesus says, stop that, don't fight. And then Jesus is hauled before various tribunals and then crucified, and at no point does he ever use any force to get out of the situation. He just makes himself available to suffer. Gibbon thought that this was a bad idea, whatever value it might have as a spiritual idea. It was a bad way to run an empire. If your ideal response to aggression is to turn the other cheek, people will, cut off both your cheeks and keep going. There may be some truth to that if you think about it as a larger, and certainly it's a contradiction in Christianity and in Christian nations. How do you deal with self-defense? Christ arguably didn't put up much self-defense. The other criticism Gibbon has of Christianity as a sort of ideology of empire is that it encourages a focus on the afterlife rather than this life. This life is seen as a kind of sinful place where everything dies and everything comes to an end, and true glory is to be found in heaven. This fits with the notion of one of the reasons that Christianity glorifies suffering is the idea, yes, you will suffer here, but by suffering here, you earn glory in heaven, which is the real value. And this comes out in any number of saints' lives from the late Roman Empire, where the standard story is that the saint, whether it's Saint Lucy or Saint Catherine or Saint Stephen or Saint Sebastian, whoever it is, there's someone who, Saint Lawrence, they believe very fervently in Christ, and they're arrested for their belief, they're persecuted, and then they're put to death in some horrible way. St. Catherine is broken on a wheel, St. Lawrence is burned alive, St. Sebastian is shot full of arrows, all these horrible, horrible, very graphic ways to die. But the moral of this story always is the saint wins because they become a saint, they are granted glory in heaven, and they've testified to the value of their faith through their suffering. Gibbon, again, says this is a bad way to run an empire. If when someone attacks you, you say, I'll show you how much I can suffer, that's not going to help. Well, this is reductive. To see Christianity as a cause for the fall of the Roman Empire is reductive on several counts. One is that the empire lasts, all of it, even the Western Empire, lasts for a good long time after adopting Christianity as religion. Constantine adopts Christianity early in the 4th century. The empire doesn't collapse in the West until the late 5th century, so there's a 150-year lag time. The other thing is that the Byzantine Empire lasts for another 1,000 years under enormous military pressure from the Persians at first, and later from the Muslim countries and the Arab peoples. And Byzantium lasts until 1452. That's 1,000 years, over 1,000 years since the conversion of Constantine. It's hard to see some kind of simple cause and effect relationship between Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire because it was Christian. The other obvious problem with Gibbon's argument against Christianity is obviously there have been other Christian nations since that time that have had no problem having large empires for long periods of time. Britain, France, arguably the United States in some ways. In any case, these nations have been at their core in terms of their religion, Christian nations. And they have had no problem being very powerful players in the global stage in terms of the Spanish Empire, of course. So it doesn't really hold up. The other thing is that since Gibbon is really good working with what he had, but that was the 18th century. We know an awful lot more about the classical world now than we did then through archaeological findings, through new texts that have been discovered, through new scholarship that allow us to do more analysis than Gibbon could, and also through the fact that even though classics is not a particularly huge academic field, there's still an awful lot of people studying ancient Greece and Rome, and so you just have more people working on the problem than you did, so we know an awful lot more. And now I don't think anyone would suggest that Christianity was one of the root causes for the collapse of the empire. In fact, in some ways, Christianity gave the empire new energies as this new religion sort of developed itself in various ways. And certainly the only thing that survived intact from the wreck of the western part of the empire was the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church became the dominant institution in Europe for about 1,000 years after the fall of the empire, because it had, as an institution, the ability to withstand the political turmoil. So in that sense, Christianity saved the empire, or saved Roman culture, rather than destroyed it. Gibbon is writing in an interesting historical moment. He's writing at a moment in the 18th century when many people are starting to question Christianity and Christian narratives, at least in their totalizing forms, and so that plays a role in it. But another question about the decline of the Roman Empire: did people experience a sense of decline at the time? And yes, they did. They were aware that this was happening. They were aware that the empire was falling apart in various ways. One of the things that was a huge shock to people and really brought things home was when Rome itself was sacked in 410 AD. A band of sort of Germanic intruders, barbarians you might call them, certain people who were not from the empire originally, were marauding through central Italy, and they actually attacked Rome and took it. Rome had enormous fortifications, these enormous walls, many of which still survive in Rome now, but they didn't have nearly enough people in the city to man the walls. It was not a defensible city, and the barbarians called their bluff and sacked the city. They damaged it in various ways. They only stayed for about 3 days, but they did a certain amount of damage, but they did even much more psychological damage, because the idea was Rome as a city was invulnerable and could never be defeated, and was the sort of icon of a place that could never fall militarily. And it was, once someone invaded it and took it over, well, that was that. I mean, it didn't have that aura of invulnerability anymore. And people responded in various ways. St. Augustine, who was alive at the time, found this to be a sort of very troubling event, but he also thought it might have a positive side in that it would open up the decline of Roman power and Roman imperial power, and the rise of the power of Germanic invaders would provide an opportunity for the conversion of these Germanic people to Christianity, which mattered more to Augustine than the empire did. And here's some of the stuff that Gibbon was playing with in his analysis of Christianity as a sort of problem for the empire, is that if you do look at a theologian like Augustine says, no, we don't want to live in the human city. We want to live in the city of God in heaven. And that's the title of his greatest work of theology, is the city of God. So the city of humanity, Rome, is vulnerable and can be invaded, but the city of God will last eternally. yes, people were aware that things were falling apart. What your take on it was differed according to where you were. If you were a landowner somewhere in France and you had been paying enormous taxes to the empire, you might be better off working with the local Germanic chieftains than paying taxes to the empire. But the collapse of finances, the collapse of the tax system led to a collapse of infrastructure, and that affected everybody in very negative ways, especially urban people. The city of Rome went through an enormous depopulation in the 5th century, partly because of the invasions, but more than the invasions, the fact that the aqueducts weren't kept up properly anymore. And the city and the grain shipments weren't coming from Rome was only able to survive as a city of 2 million people by having enormous shipments of grain brought in from Sicily and Egypt and then distributed free to Roman citizens. They were given free food to live in Rome. Once that system fell apart and the ships weren't coming regularly anymore, the city couldn't feed its people, and people just left. And there was enormous depopulation in Rome. So it was something that people were aware of. It wasn't some abstract thing like, gee, we aren't what we used to be. You know, the national spirit is a little weaker than it was. No, the water stopped running and the food stopped being in the stores, and people realized that, you know, things weren't working properly in various ways. This last week, we've been looking at the Jewish people, and that's our next question. In fact, we have several questions about the Jewish people now that we should address. One is, why were Jewish people seen negatively, especially after the Jewish War and the conquest of Jerusalem in AD 70? Why, after when the diaspora began, why were the Jews seen negatively? And there are several answers to this question. One is that minority people perhaps are often seen negatively or have the potential to be seen negatively, especially at times of social stress. If there's a group in the city that doesn't seem to belong or something like that, they often can be scapegoats when other problems come. If the water stops running in Rome, well, whose fault is it? Maybe it's the fault of those people who don't worship our gods and don't speak our language. Maybe that's their problem. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what they're up to, and I don't know. But I don't feel comfortable around them when the water's not running, and I don't know. Maybe there's something going on. You know how that kind of thing works. But there were also sort of structural problems the Jews had in terms of the society, the larger societies they lived in. In the Christian world, Jews were often seen theologically by Christians, if not on a day-to-day basis by ordinary people. The theology tended to run that either, at the best case scenario, the Jews were people who stubbornly rejected Christ. Why would anyone do that? Obviously, Christ is, if you're living in a Christian country, obviously Christ is the Son of God. Why would anyone refuse to recognize that? Everybody else sees this as normal. Why do these people hold out? They must be very stubborn, pig-headed people. They can't agree to things that any rational person would agree to. Don't know about them. That's the sort of best case scenario. The worst case scenario is some Christian theologians explicitly said that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, which is not exactly borne out by the biblical record, which seems to be pretty clear that Jesus was put to death at the hands of the Roman troops and the Roman governor. The Jews, some of the Jewish priest caste had a role in that, but of course Jesus and all of his disciples were Jews, so it's hard to say. I mean, obviously not all the Jews wanted to kill Jesus. Maybe some of the high priests who didn't like him did. That comes out in the Gospels. That also, you know, that kind of argument also avoids larger theological questions about, did Jesus want to be killed? In other words, the purpose of Jesus's mission on earth in some ways is to be sacrificed for the sins of mankind, and he certainly doesn't resist this when he has opportunities to. So if this is the fulfillment of God's plan, how much can you blame anyone for putting that plan into place? And that's a sort of thorny theological question that doesn't really respond to day-to-day realities. Certainly not the kind of blunt thinking you get in cases of prejudice between groups. So that was one reason that the Jews were seen negatively in Christian cultures. In Islamic culture, in Islamic societies, Jews were also seen as inferior because they weren't Muslim, but they were seen as superior to absolute non-believers because they at least believed in the Jewish Bible. And so they were an Abrahamic religion. They traced themselves back to Abraham, as did Christians. And Christians and Jews in Islamic societies had some penalties placed on them, but they were not persecuted as harshly as Jews were in Christian societies throughout the Middle Ages. And obviously these things change over time and are specific to time and place. But as a generalization, Jews did better in the Islamic world than they did in the Christian world in the Middle Ages, though even in the Islamic world, they were definitely seen as second-class citizens. One thing that comes out later in history, really a little bit in the Middle Ages and in post-medieval periods, is once the Jews become a successful minority and they're doing well for themselves financially, they're often seen as being sort of this minority of privileged, perversely as a privileged minority. Oh, they make all the money, they run everything, they have all this power. But that tends to be a more modern anti-Semitic stereotype. There's a little bit of that in the late Middle Ages, partly because Jews, one of the few things they could do to make money was to go into banking, because there were prohibitions on lending money at interest by both the Christian church and Muslim authorities. And so Jews were allowed to do this. And so that was something they did. Well, banking is a good business to be in if you want to make money. And this often resulted in Jews being quite wealthy. Of course, there were lots of non-Jewish bankers, the Medici family in Florence, for one. And so, again, that's a sort of gray area in some ways. Another question about Jewish history. Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, doesn't include Judaism in his timeline of history, claiming they played no major role in the legacy of European civilization. I haven't read the book *Sapiens*. I've looked at it a little bit, but I don't really know very much about it. This is a silly idea to say that the Jews played no role in European civilization. One of the things that Harari is doing in *Sapiens* is he's taking an extremely long view of history. He's talking about, well, 11,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, human beings figured out how to do this, and 11,000 years ago they figured out how to do this, and 500 years ago they figured out how to do this. And so he's not looking at sort of detail. And his book has been criticized. If you look at the reviews of the book, as I've done, you can see that there are criticisms of various specific points. He describes the battle one way, it wasn't that way, those kind of things. So that's not to blame him so much as to say when you're making a big argument, very often you get little arguments wrong. Our course obviously has taken a different view of the importance of Judaism to European civilization, and I would say it was central, largely because the Jews are the first group who developed monotheism, which is, I mean, I don't know how you talk about European civilization since the 4th century AD and not talk about monotheism. It's an enormously important intellectual and religious structure for European understanding of the world. The other thing that I would say that the Jewish people definitely give to European civilization is the idea of a minority, of a small group of people who stand for something, whether you think that something is very good or very bad, and don't agree with the majoritarian culture. That seems to me to be an enormously important part of European and post-European history. I don't know how you would look at the history of the United States, for example, and not look at the history of minority communities within the United States. The same, in some ways, is true of European history, though European history has often downplayed this. But I think that if you look at the roles of minorities, if you look at Catalans within the Iberian Peninsula, for example, if you look at the Scots in England, if you look at the Breton people and in France, the role of minorities is an important one and has historical consequences. And Jews really give a kind of paradigmatic case for that, a case of a minority. The other thing, though, is that very often in European thought, you see people who are standing up for new things. Protestants often compared themselves to Jews in the early years of Protestantism, saying that they were God's chosen people, and that that you could be right and be in the minority. These are important ideas and have really far-reaching consequences for European intellectual history and indeed global intellectual history. Another point that comes up when looking at the importance of Judaism for European history is they are arguably the one group of people who hasn't changed their belief system since the ancient period. Nobody believes anymore as a culture in the Greek and Roman gods or the ancient Egyptian gods. Those religious regimes have all passed away. Jews still believe the core fundamental tenets of Judaism are still the same as they were in the 2nd century BC. That is remarkable, and it provides a kind of through line from the ancient period into the medieval period and even the modern period. And I think if anything, the intellectual importance of Judaism as a culture and as a religion has been underplayed in general accounts of European history. So that's just me, but I designed the course. So there you go. Question about Orthodox Jews. This is an area that's getting a long way away from things I know a whole lot about. But I will say that Orthodox Judaism is not a thing, it is many things, and that historically it arises in 18th century Germany. It generally indicates a group of Jews who hold more strictly to traditional laws and customs and are less inclined to make changes in laws and customs to adapt to the world of modernity. There are various sects and groups that take this to greater or lesser extremes. And it's a fascinating subject that's outside the scope of the course, really. But it's something that does, it's not like there are Orthodox Jews back in the periods that we're studying. Orthodox Judaism as a concept is something that arises in the 18th and 19th century and arises primarily in Germany originally, but spreads throughout the Jewish community throughout the world. Question about St. Chrysostom and the Book of Common Prayer and various things. And the question brings up issues about, how do you judge the church fathers? What do you do with church fathers who, on the one hand, are articulating very attractive and very powerful sort of theological notions, and on the other hand are demonstrating various kinds of prejudice that can leave modern readers uncomfortable? Anti-Semitism, for example. Very often the church fathers' opinions of women are far from egalitarian. Very often the church fathers are very much see women as very much sort of secondary to men, which was not always arguably the role that women took in the church. And very often the church fathers are engaged in sort of putting women in their place. St. Paul, who says that it is not right for women to speak in church, that suggests that women were speaking in church. The fact that he says that the church fathers in the early church established that women may choose a religious vocation but cannot be priests. That is enormously historically important and doesn't necessarily jibe with the things that people today believe. And I think the church fathers are all, in various ways, very challenging intellectual figures for us to grapple with now, because whatever our religious beliefs or whatever our social beliefs, they are a mix of various things. Augustine, for example, you can admire Augustine enormously on a wide range of things, but one of the things that I personally always have problems with Augustine is his absolute equation of human sexuality with evil. That to me is a very strange way to look at human life. This is the way that the human race perpetuates itself. It's a natural thing that is part of everybody in one way or another. And Augustine, for various theological and intellectual reasons, just consigns all of human sexuality to sinfulness. It's just a mark of what horrible creatures we are, given the fall of humankind. The doctrine of original sin is another one that can be very troubling to square with modern ideas of justice. If you believe that children should not be punished for their parents' crimes, as most legal systems today do, then why does God punish everybody for what Adam and Eve supposedly did? And we're leaving out the question of the status of that. Is that a creation myth? Is that a historical occurrence? Who knows? But it doesn't seem fair somehow to punish. And we don't do this, right? Or we think it's a bad thing when people do, to punish someone's great-grandchildren for something their great-grandparents did. Seems harsh. And so, but one of the things the church fathers, they're doing a couple of things that I think put enormous intellectual demands on them. One is that they're trying to found a new religion and find a way that it can function in the world, because a lot of what Jesus said is based on rejecting the world. If you look at what Christ says in the Gospels, a lot of it is based on the idea that the world order is corrupt, and don't worry about it because it's coming to an end very soon. And what you need to do is turn your back on worldly corruption and devote yourself to spiritual things. This includes, at times, Christ says, leave your family. Your family isn't important. You should leave your mother and father and come with me. And join my group of spiritual adventurers and people who are striving to be right spiritually. Most people don't want to do this. Most people don't want to leave their families. Christ is very explicit about how money is not going to help you in heaven. Most people living in the world like money and want more of it. If you're going to found a religion that's not a cult, and what I mean by that is a religion that can be the basis for an entire society, including people who believe very fervently and people who believe in a less engaged manner, you have to let people on some level have families, fall in love with people and have sex, and make money. Those are things that human beings do. You won't get very far with a religion if you absolutely ban all three of those things. If you have no families, no sex, and no money, your religion won't last long. But at various points in Christian doctrine, very often, right in the Gospels, you see those things being criticized. How do you make that work? And how do you make that transition? And this relates to another question we got, which is a question I love, which is, how did Christianity spread through the Roman Empire? In other words, it spreads. Okay, I get that slaves would be Christians, right? Because Christianity says that slaves' souls are as good as emperors' souls, and everyone will go to heaven who is good, and you can be saved, and your life here is a miserable one of slavery, but in the afterlife you will live in the city of God, and everything will be wonderful. That's very attractive. I don't know why anyone wouldn't follow a religion that offered that. That seems very good. But what if you're a wealthy Roman? What if you're a wealthy Roman who's connected to the ancient power structures? Maybe you make a lot of money through ceremonial priestly functions at the Temple of Jupiter and at the Temple of Diana. Why would you become a Christian? And the answers are complex. It's not the case. Constantine converted, and that obviously had an enormous effect, because when the emperor does something, that gives it an enormous amount of weight. But that wouldn't have done it by itself to convert the empire if the empire wasn't ready to convert. If everyone in Rome had been dead set against this, Constantine would have been seen as a wingnut, and after he died, everyone would have forgotten his crazy schemes. And you can see this in Akhenaten in Egypt. Akhenaten decides that all the other gods are wrong, and you can only worship the sun god, and he makes everybody do this as long as he lives, and the minute he's dead, it all falls apart because the society doesn't share his belief. In Rome, obviously, the society did, in some sense, share his belief. These are complicated questions. What I would recommend to you, if you want to know more about them, is to read some of the books by Peter Brown. I have a couple of them here. The standard one is this one. Can you get it there? Yeah, The Rise of Western Christendom. This is a really good standard sort of history of how does Christianity go from being a minority persecuted religion to being the dominant, not just the dominant religion in Western Europe, but the main social structuring agent through the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. It's a fascinating story. Brown's really good at it. If you're specifically interested in the church and money, there's this book, Through the Eye of a Needle, and what's the Wealth, the Fall of Rome, and the Making of Christianity in the West. And this is a much more tight focus, 350 to 550. It's late empire stuff. It's what do rich people do with the church? How do they that they are very rich, but they're also believing Christians, when Christ said it was harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That's Christ in the Gospels. How do you make that fit if you're a wealthy Roman? And Brown looks at this in detail, at the various strategies that go through and ways that the church finds to use money and to use money for various purposes. One of the things Augustine does, and I'll just mention this very briefly, Augustine decides that the important thing with money is not how you got it, it's what you do with it. So, okay, you're a Roman billionaire who's made all your money off your slaves. We might say, wait a minute, that's money you made off slaves, that's bad money. Augustine doesn't see it that way. He says, no, it's not bad money. It's bad money if you don't spend it on the church. If you spend all that money you made from slaves doing good, you're redeeming yourself and you're redeeming the money. Why would you give the money away, or why would you renounce it when you could give it to the church and build up treasure for yourself in heaven by your generosity, but also take all that pain and suffering and all the exploitation that you did and put it to good ends? That's an interesting question, and it's probably where we're going to have to stop because we've only got about 5 minutes left. Few questions just very quickly. Question about the plague in the Justinianic plague that really took the wind out of the sails of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian. Did similar diseases cause the decline and fall of Rome? And the simple answer is no, they didn't. Not the same way, not in the sense of one big event like that. Role of classical culture in Byzantium. At one point in the course, I said, you know, the Byzantines rejected Greek and Roman culture, and then a student very appropriately found Byzantine writings that praised Aristotle and Plato. What I meant was not to say that they had disdain for all of Greek and Roman culture, but they let large sections of it fall into disuse. Aristotle and Plato, as great philosophers, were seen as compatible with Christianity for various reasons and were honored and kept and studied. Homer was seen as so foundational that it couldn't be lost. It had to be kept, even though its theology was wrong, clearly from a Christian point of view. But things like plays, drama, the Greek plays that we've lost, all this stuff, the temple buildings and structures and pagan holy places were allowed to fall into disrepair. It was that kind of thing I was thinking of. So it's a more complex question than my generalization would suggest, but there was a general rejection of sort of pagan culture with a few things carried forward. The same thing happened in the West, in Rome. Writers would sometimes be kept because they were seen as good stylistic models, even though their subject matter was pagan. So that's a good question. The last question we'll look at is the whole question of the greens and the blues in Byzantium. The student writes, Procopius has me confused. I thought the blues and the greens were chariot racing teams. How did chariot racing teams make the whole Roman Empire shake to its foundation? And this is one of the fascinating things, is they did. We all know that there can be outbreaks of violence at sporting events, but nothing like what happened in Byzantium. Basically, chariot racing was the most popular sport. It brought the city together in all sorts of different ways around chariot racing, but the factions that grew up around the racers embodied other fissures in society. Different aristocratic groups paid for different teams. So it became a kind of flashpoint for a sort of gang war between different factions within the city, and it is as historically documented as anything that a fight over chariot racing led to some of the largest urban riots ever in the early years of the Byzantine Empire. And this came because the chariot racing was not just chariot racing. It embodied a whole host of other things that sort of found their tipping point or their flashpoint in the question of who won the chariot race. But obviously there was a lot going on. But yes, these were team sports. It's a great source of passion. So that's all we have time for today. I hope you keep enjoying the course. We have a couple weeks left to get through the Middle Ages. We still have the Crusades and the Great Plague and all sorts of fun to look forward to. So I hope I've addressed some of your questions and concerns, and I hope you keep enjoying the course. Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure.